To do a part two here so we could focus a little bit more on this idea of clash of culture, and I will continue to be quick. Modernism versus fundamentalism. So, the more modern society became in the 1920s, the more there is half of the American people who embrace the change, embrace the moving forward, embrace the different and new. And there is another half of the American population that would be considered to be fundamentalist, that are reacting against the change, against the movement forward. So for every group of Americans that embraced women's suffrage and women's rights, there was another group of Americans who pushed equally as hard for a woman's places in the home type things, right? So for every group of Americans that was pushing into this new modern era, there was another group that was clinging to the more traditional American ways of life. And I'm going to go through this without any judgment on those values and just present them to you. So the first example in your textbook and then in this conversation is the Scopes trial, which involved the ACLU, this newly formed group, the American Civil Liberties Union, which was founded to focus on violation of Americans' rights, a lot of times focused on anti-Semitism. Clarence Darrow, an incredibly well-known American lawyer, and William Jennings Bryan, another really well-known political figure and also a lawyer. And it takes place, the Scopes trial does, in a small town in Tennessee where a biology teacher taught evolution, which was against the law. He is arrested for it. The Scopes trial is named after the teacher, John T. Scopes. He will be convicted of it. Clarence Darrow will be his lawyer, and William Jennings Bryan will be the lawyer for the government. And it's sometimes called the monkey trial, and it is seen as this clash of these newfangled scientific ideas versus we're not monkeys, what about God? Right? And so Scopes trial is always this poster child for this clash of values, this modernism versus fundamentalism. Another example of this is, and this progressive, remember we're still progressives, right? Not necessarily a progressive president, but in a lot of ways still a progressive society, is prohibition. Progressives had been targeting the sale of alcohol for a long time and blaming alcohol for a lot of different social problems. And so you also had a lot of women. There's a well-known woman named Frances Willard who's involved in the temperance movement, who push for moderation at first and then prohibition. In 1920, the Volstead Act gives the Treasury the actual power to enforce prohibition. This is when you'll see the rise of speakeasies, bootlegging, organized crime. There's Al Capone down there in the bottom right. The 18th Amendment will be reversed. 18th Amendment is prohibition. It will be reversed in 1933 with the passage of the 21st Amendment, prohibition. There's a real big campaign with when the 18th Amendment is passed. There you have a brewer, obviously fat on profits, right? Vote wet for my sake, as in, vote against prohibition. And the mom at home, presumably her husband is out drunk somewhere, spent all of their money probably on alcohol. And she says, but vote dry for mine. There she is with the children at home. So it is a definite clash of values. You also have the existence and prevalence of xenophobia, which is the fear of foreigners, essentially, and racial unrest. And a lot of the fear of foreigners stuff and immigration fears comes from the Russian Revolution of 1917. And this idea that Vladimir Lenin in Russia and others advocated for a worldwide communist revolution, death to capitalism. And so all of a sudden, every immigrant, particularly those from Eastern Europe, were suspicious. I've mentioned Sacco and Vanzetti before, and the Palmeraids. In fact, this exact slide I've been through before. I just wanted to put it up here to reiterate some of the things that we have been talking about. Love that political cartoon. As the trial of Italian immigrant Sacco and Vanzetti came to a close, another social issue involved the ongoing boom in immigration continued. As in the past, nativists, or those who preferred native-born Americans, remember they don't mean Native Americans, argued that new arrivals took jobs away from native-born workers and threatened American religious, political, and cultural traditions. You hear a lot of these exact same arguments today. So many issues surrounding immigration are just recycled, from year to year. The National Origin Act of 1924 was designed to institute a quota system and essentially say that you could have a certain percentage of immigrants that had come in like 10 years prior. So what that does, you have the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and then the National Origin Act of 1924, which makes the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 permanent, is it leads to a massive decrease in immigration. And I want you to look right there. Do you all see that? What is happening here? We are cracking down on immigration, particularly immigration from Eastern Europe, like let's say Poland, for example. Okay? What is going on in the world in 1940, in 1938, in 1937, in 1936? The Holocaust is going on. And so we really will be thinking about what our immigration policies meant for Jewish refugees during that time period. And I'm not trying to be overly dramatic about it, but it is a very interesting sort of conflation of events. This is a political cartoon. Again, 3% of the people who wanted entry. Uncle Sam has a funnel and a form. So immigration restrictions were an attempt to turn back the clock to what many saw as a simpler or a better time. Many lashed out at symbols of change. Some turned to organizations that supported doctrines of hate and employed violence to achieve their ends. This is an incredibly disturbing image. This is the Klan with their hoods up, feeling extremely comfortable at the Capitol, and marching in Washington, D.C. Warren G. Harding is a one-term governor of Ohio. He will be elected, as we've said before, with his slogan, "A return to normalcy." His cabinet is stacked full of really fascinating people. You have Herbert Hoover, Andrew Mellon. He's a business tycoon. He's going to be Secretary of the Treasury, which tells you right off the bat that they're going to be pro-business. But he is a journalist, actually. He ran a newspaper. He's not a politician before he's governor, and he doesn't know how to run things. And so what he does is he relies on his friends, the so-called Ohio gang, because he's from Ohio. So he brings all his buddies from Ohio with him, and they just run wild. And President Harding is said to have presided over one of, if not the most, corrupt administrations in American history. He himself is not regarded as corrupt, but his administration is regarded as corrupt because he didn't, that phrase Truman always used, the buck stops here. He didn't have any kind of phrase like that. And he just didn't keep an eye on people. He didn't set a standard for behavior and integrity. And so people took advantage of that. There were bribery scandals. One really well-known one was the Teapot Dome scandal that involved many members of his cabinet, including his Secretary of Interior, who was leasing government land to oil companies in exchange for bribes. And it really does ultimately end up harming his reputation. Harding dies pretty suddenly in 1922, and his vice president, a man named Calvin Coolidge, takes over. Calvin Coolidge's nickname was Silent Cal, because he never spoke. He decides he's not going to run again after his term is over, and he types out on really small slips of paper, "I do not intend to seek a second term," and then he went in and handed them out to the press corps. People used to take bets, like they would sit their wife next to him at a dinner party to see if she could get him talking, and I can get him to say more than 2 words in a row, but nobody could ever do it. He was just incredibly quiet. If anybody knows anybody like that. Andrew Mellon stays on as his Secretary of Treasury, and he is going to promote supply-side economics. Supply-side economics really, honestly, doesn't work. You've heard it before as trickle-down economics. It's this idea that if you promote successful conditions for large businesses, that their profits will eventually trickle down to the workers. That it doesn't necessarily ever happen. Herbert Hoover is also going to work in Coolidge's administration, and he will run for the presidency after Coolidge and be successful. He believed in cooperative individualism. So government shouldn't mandate that businesses work together with the federal government to encourage growth and prosperity. Businesses would want to do that out of the goodness of their corporate hearts, which of course we know is false. So they are very pro-business, Harding, Coolidge working together with Andrew Mellon. The election of 1928 will see Herbert Hoover versus Al Smith. Hoover is Republican, and Calvin Coolidge was very popular, a very successful president, and so people really wanted Coolidge to run again. Coolidge was just not interested, and so Herbert Hoover becomes president. And as we know, he has a lot of issues that I don't think are entirely his fault. Smith doesn't really stand a chance because, one, he's tied to the corruption at Tammany Hall, and people are tired of corruption, and two, he's Catholic. And as we know, we are currently in the administration of our second Catholic president, but Catholics serving as president have been controversial, and he was met with a lot of nativist sentiment. Herbert Hoover, in his inaugural address, says, "I have no fears for the future of our country. It is bright with hope." By 1929, some economists are observing that soaring stock prices were based on little more than confidence. The prices had no basis in reality. We are about to talk about the stock market crash, the causes of the Great Depression. Remember that the stock market crashes in 1929, but it is not the cause of the Depression. It is a symptom of the Depression. And that is what we will pick up with.